The invitation on a crisp autumn morning, Karoline Leavitt sat in her office at the White House scrolling through her emails when she noticed one that made her pause. The subject line read, "Jimmy Kimmel Live, Guest Invitation." She clicked. It opened, her eyebrows raising slightly as she read the contents. "They want me on Kimmel?" she said aloud to her empty office, a mix of surprise and wariness in her voice. At 30 years old, Karoline was the youngest White House press secretary in American history. Her daily press briefings had become must-watch events for political junkies, where her quick thinking and unflinching responses to reporters had earned her both admirers and critics. Later that afternoon, Karoline called a meeting with her communications team. 6 people crowded into her office, coffee cups in hand, expressions ranging from excited to deeply concerned. "So, Kimmel wants me on his show next week," Karoline announced, leaning against her desk. Jake, her deputy, immediately shook his head. "Bad idea. His audience isn't exactly friendly to this administration." "That's exactly why I'm considering it," Karoline replied, crossing her arms. "We can't just keep talking to people who already agree with us." The room fell into debate. Some argued it was a valuable opportunity to reach younger viewers who didn't watch traditional news. Others warned it was a trap. Late-night shows were notorious for making political figures look foolish. Remember when he had Secretary Wilson on last year? Lisa, her media advisor, pointed out. That was brutal. He didn't even try to hide his contempt. Karoline nodded, recalling the uncomfortable interview. "But I'm not Wilson. I can handle tough questions." As the meeting wrapped up, opinions remained divided. Karoline walked to the window, looking out at the Washington Monument in the distance. She'd grown up watching late-night TV. The thought of sitting on that famous couch, regardless of the politics, held a certain appeal. That evening, Karoline called her father from her apartment. The TV played softly in the background as she paced around her living room, phone pressed to her ear. "Dad, what do you think? Everyone at work is split." Her father, a former small-town mayor who'd taught her everything she knew about politics, was silent for a moment before answering. "Honey, sometimes you have to walk into the lion's den to show people you're not afraid. But make no mistake, Kimmel isn't a reporter. He's an entertainer. His job is ratings, not fairness." After hanging up, Karoline made herself a cup of tea and sat on her couch, deep in thought. On her coffee table lay briefing books and policy papers, her typical evening reading. But tonight she opened her laptop instead and searched for Jimmy Kimmel political interviews. For the next 2 hours, she watched clip after clip. She noted how Kimmel used humor to disarm guests, how he could pivot from jokes to serious questions without warning, how his audience reactions influenced the conversation's direction. The next morning, Karoline called the show's producer. "I'll do it," she said firmly. "But I want to be clear about something. I'm not coming on for a gotcha moment. I'm happy to discuss policy differences, but I expect a fair conversation." The producer's voice was cheerful, perhaps overly so. "Of course, Ms. Leavitt. Jimmy always aims for respectful dialogue even when there are disagreements. We're excited to have you." As the day of the interview approached, Karoline prepared, rigorously. Her team ran mock interviews with someone playing an especially hostile Kimmel. They prepared responses for questions about controversial policies, rehearsed ways to pivot from difficult topics, and practiced injecting humor into tense moments. "Remember," her media coach advised, "late night isn't like a press briefing. It's okay to show personality. Laugh at yourself sometimes. The audience responds better to humanity than to talking points." The night before the interview, Karoline barely slept. She tossed and turned, imagining various scenarios. What if she froze on camera? What if she became the subject of viral clips, but not in the way she intended? When her alarm went off at 5:30 a.m., she was already awake. She got dressed carefully, choosing a bold blue suit that looked good on camera, but wasn't flashy enough to distract from her words. As she applied her makeup, she stared at her reflection. "You can do this," she told herself. "You've faced tougher crowds than a studio audience." Her car arrived at 7 a.m. to take her to the airport. As they drove through the streets of Washington, still quiet in the early morning, her phone buzzed with a text from the president himself. "They're expecting a deer in headlights. Show them a lion instead. We're all watching tonight." The pressure of that message stayed with her on the flight to Los Angeles. The president rarely communicated directly about media appearances, preferring to leave that to the communications team. His personal interest highlighted just how high stakes this interview was. When Karoline arrived at her hotel in LA, a gift basket awaited her with a note from the show's staff welcoming her to California. The gesture seemed friendly enough, but she couldn't help wondering if it was meant to lower her guard. That afternoon, a producer called to run through the schedule. "We'll have a car pick you up at 4 p.m., hair and makeup at the studio, then a brief chat with Jimmy before the show. Is there anything specific you'd like to discuss or avoid?" "I'm open to discussing any policy questions," Karoline replied, confidently. "But I'd appreciate if we could focus on substance rather than Twitter controversies." "Of course," the producer assured her. Jimmy's looking forward to a substantive conversation. Later, alone in her hotel room, Karoline ordered room service and reviewed her notes one last time. She'd been in politics long enough to know that looking forward to a substantive conversation could mean many things. Her phone rang again. This time it was Lisa from her team. "Just got word from our contact at the network," Lisa said, her voice tense. "They've been promoting your appearance heavily. The promos are, well, they're framing it as some kind of political showdown." Karoline's stomach tightened. "Send me the clip." Moments later, her phone dinged with a video message. She pressed play and watched as dramatic music played over side-by-side images of her and Kimmel, with a voiceover promising "the face-off you've been waiting for" and "no topic off limits." "Great," Karoline muttered. "So much for a friendly chat." "Do you want to cancel?" Lisa asked. "We could cite scheduling conflicts." Karoline considered it for a moment. Backing out now would look like fear, and in politics, perception was everything. Besides, she'd prepared extensively. Maybe she could surprise everyone, including Kimmel himself. "No," she decided. "I'm doing it. But have the team ready for rapid response if things go sideways." At exactly 4 p.m., a black SUV arrived at her hotel. The driver, a friendly woman named Tanya, chatted with her about LA traffic as they made their way to the studio, a welcome distraction from Karoline's growing nervousness. When they arrived at the studio, Karoline was escorted through a side entrance away from the gathering audience. The hallways buzzed with activity: crew members with headsets, interns carrying coffee, writers huddled in corners discussing last-minute changes. In the makeup room, the artist worked quickly while making small talk about the weather and asking if Karoline had visited LA before. It felt strangely normal, almost soothing, this familiar ritual of television preparation. Just as the makeup artist was finishing, there was a knock at the door. A production assistant poked her head in. "Ms. Leavitt? Jimmy would like to meet you before the show if you're ready." Karoline nodded, standing up and smoothing her suit. This was it, the moment of truth. As she followed the assistant down the corridor toward Kimmel's office, she recalled all the times she'd faced hostile press rooms, aggressive reporters, and challenging interviews. "I've handled worse," she thought to herself. "This is just another day at the office." But deep down she knew this wasn't just another interview. It was a test of her skills, her composure, and perhaps most importantly, her ability to represent the administration in territory that was anything but friendly. When she reached Kimmel's door, she took a deep breath, put on her most con. The door swung open, and there stood Jimmy Kimmel himself, dressed casually in jeans and a button-up shirt, looking more relaxed than he did on television. His familiar smile seemed genuine as he extended his hand. "Karoline, thanks for coming. Not many press secretaries would brave the lion's den," he said, shaking her hand firmly. "Well, the White House briefing room has its own set of lions," she replied with a measured smile. "This is just a different jungle." Jimmy laughed, gesturing for her to take a seat in his office. The walls were covered with photos of him with celebrities and political figures from both parties. Karoline noticed several with past presidents, including a few with her boss's political rivals. "Can I get you anything? Water? Coffee?" Jimmy asked. "Water would be great, thanks," she said, settling into a comfortable chair across from his desk. As Jimmy poured water from a pitcher, he spoke casually. "So, just to give you a heads up on tonight's flow, we'll start with some light banter, maybe talk about what it's like being the youngest press secretary in history, then move into some policy questions. Nothing you haven't handled before." Karoline nodded, accepting the glass. "Sounds good. I appreciate the overview." "Look," Jimmy said, leaning forward slightly. "I know the promos make this look like they're setting up some kind of political cage match. That's just TV hype. I'm not looking to ambush you." Karoline took a sip of water, studying his face. Was this sincerity or strategy? In her world, pre-interview chats like this often masked tougher intentions. "I'm glad to hear that," she replied diplomatically. "I'm here for a conversation, not a confrontation." "Great," Jimmy said, glancing at his watch. "We should probably head to the stage soon. The audience is being seated now." As they walked through the backstage area, crew members nodded respectfully. Some looked surprised to see Karoline and Jimmy walking together, chatting like old acquaintances rather than political opponents. "By the way," Jimmy added as they approached the stage, "the audience is always a mix. Some will be with you, some won't. Just be yourself. Authenticity plays well, even with people who disagree with you." Karoline appreciated the advice, though. She'd been navigating hostile rooms for years. "Thanks. I'll keep that in mind." A production assistant fitted Karoline with a microphone, checking the sound levels as she waited in the wings. She could hear the warm-up comedian getting the audience energized, their laughter and applause echoing through the studio. The band began playing the show's theme music, and Karoline took a deep breath. This was it. "Tonight," she heard Jimmy announce, "we have a very special guest. She's the voice of the administration, the youngest White House press secretary in history. Please welcome Karoline Leavitt." The applause as she walked onto the stage was polite but noticeably mixed. Some audience members stood, others remained seated with crossed arms. Karoline smiled broadly, waving as she crossed to the couch where Jimmy waited. "Karoline, welcome to the show," Jimmy said after the applause died down. "Thanks for having me, Jimmy. It's quite a change from the briefing room." "I bet," Jimmy laughed. "Our audience is much better looking than the White House press corps." The audience chuckled, and Karoline felt herself relaxing slightly. Maybe this wouldn't be the ambush everyone had warned her about. "So you're making history as the youngest press secretary ever," Jimmy began. "What's that like? Most people your age are still figuring out how to do their laundry properly." The audience laughed, and Karoline smiled. "Well, I still sometimes shrink my sweaters, so I haven't figured everything out yet." This drew more laughter, genuine this time. "But it's an incredible honor. Every day I walk into that briefing room aware of the responsibility I have." Speaking of responsibility, Jimmy transitioned smoothly. "Let's talk about some of the statements you've had to defend recently." And there it was, the pivot she'd been expecting. Karoline maintained her composure, nodding slightly. "There's been quite a bit of controversy around the administration's climate policy," Jimmy continued. "Last week, you said the president's plan was the most aggressive environmental agenda in history, but environmental groups have called it woefully inadequate. How do you square those two viewpoints?" The question was direct but fair. Karoline launched into her prepared response, highlighting specific elements of the policy, acknowledging criticisms but defending the administration's approach as realistic and achievable. Jimmy listened, nodding occasionally, then followed up. "But isn't it true that these targets fall well short of what scientists say we need to prevent the worst impacts of climate change?" The audience seemed to lean forward collectively, sensing the shift in tone. Karoline felt the atmosphere tightening, but stayed on message. "Scientists provide the data, Jimmy, and we value their input enormously. But policy has to balance environmental goals with economic realities. We're committed to fighting climate change without putting millions of Americans out of work." A smattering of applause came from one section of the audience. Jimmy glanced their way, then back to Karoline. "Let's shift gears a bit," he said. The economy. Inflation has been a major concern for many Americans. Your administration has claimed victory over inflation, but grocery prices are still much higher than they were 3 years ago. Are you out of touch with what ordinary people are experiencing? The question landed like a slap, framed to put her on the defensive. Karoline noticed Jimmy's demeanor had subtly changed, less casual, more prosecutorial. Nobody's claiming victory, she replied evenly. What we've said is that inflation has significantly decreased from its peak. We acknowledge that prices remain higher than pre-pandemic levels, which is why the president's economic plan focuses on reducing costs for working families. Jimmy seemed ready to push back, but Karoline continued. Look, I go to the grocery store too. I see the prices. The question isn't whether things cost more, they do, but whether our policies are moving in the right direction. All indicators show they are. Some audience members nodded in agreement. Others looked unconvinced. Fair point, Jimmy conceded, surprising her slightly. But speaking of direction, let's talk about immigration. For the next several minutes, they went back and forth on border policy. Jimmy pressed hard, occasionally using humor to soften his challenges, but never backing down. Karoline held her ground, refusing to be rattled even when the audience reaction favored Jimmy's perspective. During the commercial break, Jimmy leaned over. You're doing great, he said quietly. Most politicians start sweating by now. Karoline smiled tightly. The day I can't handle tough questions is the day I should find a new job. When they returned from the break, Jimmy's tone shifted again. Before we go, I want to show you something that's been making the rounds online. Karoline's internal alarm bells rang. This hadn't been mentioned in their pre-interview chat. Roll the clip, please, Jimmy said, gesturing to a screen behind them. The monitor lit up with a series of clips, Karoline at various press briefings, edited together to show her giving seemingly contradictory answers on the same policy issues. The editing was clever, stripping away context and creating the impression of deliberate deception. The audience laughed at several points, and Karoline felt her face flush. She recognized every clip, but knew each had been carefully selected and arranged to create a false narrative. When the video ended, Jimmy turned to her with a raised eyebrow. Care to explain the evolution in thinking we just witnessed? The studio fell silent. Karoline could feel hundreds of eyes on her, waiting for her response. This was the moment. Either she would crumble or rise to the occasion. That's quite an editing job, she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. But as someone who deals with the press every day, I know how selective clips can create a narrative that doesn't reflect reality. She turned slightly to address the audience directly. What you just saw were statements made months apart during evolving situations. Policy positions adapt to new information and changing circumstances. That's not flip-flopping, it's responsible governance. Turning back to Jimmy, she added, I'd be happy to go through each of those clips and provide the full context, but I suspect that wouldn't make for very entertaining television. A few audience members clapped, seemingly impressed by her poise. Jimmy looked momentarily caught off guard by her direct challenge. We're almost out of time, he said, recovering quickly. But I appreciate you coming on the show and facing the music, so to speak. Anytime, Karoline replied with a confident smile that belied the tension she felt. Open dialogue is important especially when, we disagree. As the Enis show wrapped up and the band played them out, Jimmy shook her hand. You're tougher than I expected, he said, quiet enough that only she could hear. I get that a lot, Karoline replied, maintaining her smile for the cameras still rolling. Walking offstage, Karoline could hear the mixed reaction from the audience, some cheering, others notably silent. She had survived, perhaps even scored some points, but she knew this was just the first round of what promised to be a long night in the public eye. Fident smile, and knocked. Backstage, Karoline was greeted by a production assistant who guided her to a small green room. You can relax here during the commercial break. We'll come get you for the second segment in about 8 minutes. Karoline nodded, surprised. Second segment? I thought we were done. Oh no, the assistant said, checking. her clipboard. There's another segment after this commercial break. Didn't Jimmy mention it? He hadn't. Karoline felt a flutter of unease but kept her expression neutral. Must have slipped his mind. Alone in the green room, Karoline quickly pulled out her phone and typed a message to her team. Surprise second segment coming up. That video montage was just the appetizer. She sent it, then took a deep breath, reviewing mentally what had just happened and preparing for what might come next. Her phone buzzed almost immediately with a response from Lisa. You're handling it like a pro. Stay on message. We're monitoring. Twitter, mixed reaction, but you're holding your own. Karoline poured herself a glass of water from a pitcher on the side table, her hand steady despite her racing thoughts. The edited video had been a calculated move, designed to throw her off balance. What else did Kimmel have planned? A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. The same production assistant poked her head in. 2 minutes, Ms. Leavitt. Karoline straightened her jacket and checked her reflection. And a mirror on the wall. She looked composed, professional. Exactly the image she wanted to project, regardless of how tense she felt inside. As she was led back to the stage, she could hear Jimmy warming up the audience. We're back with White. House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt for our second segment. Now, I promised we'd get into some of the more controversial issues, and Karoline has been gracious enough to stick around. The audience applauded as Karoline walked back onto the set, her smile firmly in place. As she sat down, she noticed something different. A small monitor had been set up on the table between them. Welcome back, Karoline, Jimmy said, his tone friendly but with an edge that hadn't been there before. So before the break, we were talking about consistency in messaging. I want to continue that theme if you don't mind. Of course, Karoline replied evenly. Great, Jimmy said, picking up a remote control. I thought we might play a little game I call fact or fiction. The audience laughed and cheered. Clearly, this was something they'd seen before, but it was new to Karoline. She maintained her smile, though wariness crept through her. It's pretty simple, Jimmy explained. I'll show some clips of statements from the administration, and you tell us if they're factually accurate or not. Ready? Before she could respond, Jimmy pressed a button on the remote. The monitor displayed a clip of the president at a rally, making a claim about job creation numbers that Karoline knew immediately were exaggerated. When the clip ended, Jimmy turned to her expectantly. Fact or fiction? The studio fell silent. Karoline knew she was in a no-win situation. Defend the inaccurate statement and lose credibility. Admit it was wrong and create a headline about the administration's dishonesty. Context matters, Jimmy, she began carefully. Those numbers were projections based on— Sorry, Jimmy interrupted. The game is called fact or fiction, not context matters. Is the statement factually accurate? Yes or no? A few audience members laughed. Others seemed uncomfortable with the confrontational turn. Karoline leaned forward slightly. I understand the format you're going for, but reality isn't always black and white. Those job numbers were preliminary and were later revised, as happens with economic data all the time. Jimmy raised an eyebrow. So, fiction. The final numbers were different from what the president stated at that time, Karoline conceded, carefully. But the broader point about job growth was accurate. We'll count that as fiction, Jimmy said triumphantly. Let's try another one. He pressed the remote again. This time, the clip showed Karoline herself at a press briefing, responding to a question about healthcare policy. The clip had been cut in a way that made her answer seem evasive. That clip is edited, Karoline said immediately when it ended. My complete answer addressed the specifics of the policy, but that portion was cut out. Jimmy looked surprised. Are you suggesting we deliberately edited the clip to make you look bad? I'm stating a fact, Karoline replied, her voice firm but calm. That was not my complete answer to that question. I have the transcript from that briefing, and I'd be happy to read what I actually said, the audience murmured. Some people seemed impressed by her pushback. Jimmy glanced off stage, perhaps at a producer, then back to Karoline. Well, we don't have time to go through transcripts. Let's move on to something else. He set down the remote and shifted in his chair. There's been a lot of talk about transparency in your administration. Critics say you've been less accessible to the press than your predecessors. How do you respond to that? Karoline felt on firmer ground with this question. I hold briefings more frequently than the previous administration did in their final year. We've also implemented regular policy-specific briefings with cabinet secretaries and expanded press access to executive agencies. So the data simply doesn't support that criticism. But what about the president's availability? Jimmy pressed. He's given fewer formal press conferences than any modern president at this point in their term. The president communicates directly with the American people in multiple forums, Karoline countered. He's done town halls, one-on-one interviews, and engages with the press during his working events. The idea that he's inaccessible just isn't accurate. As she spoke, Karoline noticed a shift in the audience's energy. Some were nodding along, seemingly impressed by her command of facts and her refusal to be rattled. Jimmy must have sensed it too because he abruptly changed tactics. Let's talk about your personal journey for a moment. You're quite young to hold such a high-profile position. Do you ever feel out of your depth? The question was clearly designed to make her seem inexperienced, but Karoline had faced this line of attack before. Age and capability aren't the same thing, Jimmy, she replied with a slight smile. I've been in politics and communications for my entire professional career. I worked on 2 presidential campaigns, served as a spokesperson for Congress, and directed communications for major policy initiatives. My age might be unusual for this role, but my qualifications aren't. A section of the audience applauded spontaneously. Jimmy seemed momentarily thrown off by the positive reaction. Fair enough, he conceded. But you have to admit, defending some of the administration's more controversial positions must be challenging. Are there ever moments when you personally disagree with what you're asked to represent publicly? It was a classic trap question, designed to either make her seem like a mindless loyalist or create daylight between her and the administration. Everyone who's ever been a spokesperson has faced that question, Karoline responded thoughtfully. Here's what I believe. My job is to accurately represent the president's positions and policies. Do I debate these issues internally? Of course, that's part of a healthy policy process. But once decisions are made, my role is to communicate them effectively. Jimmy leaned forward. So you're saying you never have to defend positions you personally disagree with? I'm saying that's not the right frame for understanding this job, Karoline replied. I wouldn't be here if I didn't broadly support the president's agenda. On specific issues, there are robust internal discussions, but those stay in the room, as they should in any effective organization. The audience seemed to appreciate her thoughtful response, and even Jimmy nodded slightly. We're almost out of time, he said, but I have one more question. Given the polarized state of our politics, do you think shows like this, where people from different political perspectives actually talk to each other, are helpful, or do they just create more division? It was an interesting pivot, and Karoline recognized it as an opportunity to end on a positive note. I think they're essential, Jimmy, she said sincerely. Look, we've had some tense moments tonight. You've asked tough questions, I've pushed back at times, but that's how democracy is supposed to work. We can disagree, even strongly, without being enemies. The real problem comes when we stop talking to each other altogether. The audience applauded, more enthusiastically than they had all night. Jimmy nodded, seeming genuinely appreciative of her answer. Well said, and despite our differences, I want to thank you for coming on tonight. Not many in your position would take the risk. Thanks for having me, Karoline replied. And if you ever want a tour of the White House briefing room, the invitation is open. You might find it's even tougher than your studio. Jimmy laughed. I might take you up on that. Ladies and gentlemen, White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt. The band played as the audience applauded. As they went to commercial, Jimmy leaned over to shake Karoline's hand again. You handled that better than most politicians who come on here, he said quietly. That's because I'm not most politicians, she replied with a genuine smile, feeling the tension of the past hour finally beginning to ease. As she walked off stage, Karoline knew the real test was just beginning. Within minutes, clips from this interview would be circulating online, analyzed by pundits, praised by supporters, and criticized by opponents. But for now, she felt a quiet satisfaction. She had walked into the lion's den and emerged not just unscathed, but perhaps even stronger. Karoline followed a production assistant through the backstage area, the sound of the audience's applause fading behind her. Her phone buzzed constantly in her pocket, undoubtedly her team reacting to the interview in real time. But before she could check her messages, a man with a headset approached her urgently. "Ms. Leavitt, Jimmy would like you to come back for one more segment after the musical performance. He has a few final questions." Karoline paused. This was now the second surprise extension of her appearance. "That wasn't in the schedule we agreed to," she said, keeping her voice level. The man shrugged apologetically. "Last-minute producer decision. The audience is really engaged with your conversation. Ratings are spiking." Of course they were. Conflict. Made for good television. Karoline weighed her options quickly. Walking out now might seem like she was running away. Staying meant facing more unexpected challenges, but she hadn't come this far to back down. "Fine. How long do I have before we're back on?" "About 12 minutes. The band is doing 2 songs. Karoline nodded and was shown to the green room again. Once alone, she finally pulled out her phone. 23 text messages, most from her communications team. She opened their group chat first. The messages ranged from supportive, standing your ground on the edited clips, perfect, to concerned, heads up, Twitter is blowing up about the fact fiction segment, opposition already cutting ads from it. Lisa had sent a private message. White House called POTUS watching, impressed so far but concerned about the ambush tactics. Your call whether to continue or cite the schedule violation and leave. Karoline took a deep breath. The president was watching. No pressure there, she texted back. Doing one more segment. Better to see this through than create a press secretary flees Kimmel headline. She used the remaining minutes to freshen up, take a few sips of water, and collect her thoughts. Whatever Kimmel had planned for this final segment, she needed to be ready. When the production assistant returned to escort her back to the stage, Karoline noticed something different. The crew members she passed were whispering to each other, giving her strange looks. Something had changed during the musical break. As she approached the stage, she heard Jimmy's voice. "And we're thrilled she's agreed to stay for one more segment. Please welcome back White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt." The audience applause seemed more subdued this time, as Karoline walked out, smiling and waving. When she sat down, she immediately sensed a shift in Jimmy's demeanor. His smile seemed tighter, his posture more rigid. "Karoline, thanks for sticking around," he said. "During the break, we received some interesting news that I'd like to get your reaction to." Her political instincts flared in warning. This was the real ambush. "Breaking news just came in about a significant policy reversal from your administration," Jimmy continued, now addressing both Karoline and the audience. "According to reports, the president has just signed an executive order that directly contradicts statements you made earlier in this very interview." Karoline kept her expression neutral despite her racing thoughts. What policy? What reversal? She hadn't been briefed on any executive orders scheduled for today. "Our producers are telling me," Jimmy went on, looking at his earpiece as if receiving information, "that the order relates to the energy policy you defended about 20 minutes ago." The audience murmured. Karoline noticed cameras zooming in on her face, obviously hoping to catch her looking surprised or confused. "Jimmy," she said calmly, "I was in communication with the White House right before coming on stage, and there was no mention of a new executive order being signed today. Do you have a specific source for this breaking news?" Jimmy looked momentarily thrown off by her direct question. "It's being reported by several news outlets," he said vaguely. "Which ones specifically?" Karoline pressed. Years of handling press briefings had taught her never to respond to reports without verifying the source. Jimmy glanced off stage, then back at Karoline. "Well, we're still confirming the details, but the reports are circulating widely on social media." Now Karoline understood. There was no executive order. This was a tactic to get her to slip up, to respond to something that hadn't happened, and create a viral moment at her expense. I think it's important that we deal with verified facts, she said, her voice firm but not confrontational. Especially in an era where misinformation spreads so quickly. If the president had signed a major executive order today, I would have been briefed on it, so I'm confident in saying those reports are inaccurate. A few audience members clapped, seemingly appreciating her refusal to take the bait. Jimmy shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Well, let's move on then. There's another topic I wanted to address. Actually, Jimmy, Karoline interrupted, something she rarely did but felt necessary now. I think this is an important teaching moment about media literacy. You just presented unverified information as breaking news on national television. Isn't that exactly the kind of thing that erodes public trust in media? The audience fell completely silent. No one had expected her to turn the tables so directly. Jimmy's face flushed slightly. We present information as it comes to us and update our viewers if it changes. That's standard practice in live television. But shouldn't basic verification happen before presenting something as fact? Karoline countered, especially something as significant as a presidential executive order. Jimmy clearly wanted to move on. Fair point. Let's talk about, I'm happy to discuss any topic, Karoline said, but I think your viewers deserve to know if that breaking news was real or not. Because if it wasn't, they should be informed that they were just presented with misinformation. A producer rushed onto the stage and whispered something to Jimmy. He nodded, then turned back to the camera. We're receiving clarification on that. Breaking news, he announced. It appears the reports about a new executive order were premature. We apologize for the confusion. The apology seemed forced, but Karoline nodded appreciatively. Thank you for that clarification. Jimmy tried to regain control of the interview. Let's talk about foreign policy. Your administration has been criticized for its approach to the ongoing situation in Eastern Europe. Critics say you've been too cautious. How do you respond? Karoline recognized this as an attempt to move to safer ground for Jimmy. She decided to allow it, having already made her point about the fake breaking news. Foreign policy requires careful balance, she replied. The president's approach has been deliberate, working closely with our allies to present a united front. The results speak for themselves. We've seen de-escalation in key areas and strengthened international partnerships. Jimmy nodded, seeming relieved to be back on script. But some would argue that more decisive action early on could have prevented the situation from deteriorating as much as it did. They went back and forth on foreign policy for several minutes, the conversation noticeably more balanced than earlier segments. The audience seemed engaged, and even Jimmy appeared to be listening more thoughtfully to her responses. Then, just as the tension had begun to ease, Jimmy delivered his final blow. Before we wrap up, I want to address something personal. He said, his tone suddenly serious. There have been rumors circulating about your background and qualifications. Some have suggested that your rapid rise to this position had more to do with connections than competence. The implication was clear and deliberately offensive. Karoline felt a flash of genuine anger but kept her expression composed. I think my record speaks for itself, she replied, her voice steady despite her rising indignation. I've worked in political communications for my entire career, starting as an intern and working my way up through increasingly responsible positions. Every job I've held, I've earned through hard work and results. But you have to admit your age makes your appointment unusual, Jimmy pressed. My age makes it historic, not undeserved, Karoline corrected him. And frankly, Jimmy, I'm surprised by the implication. Would you ask a man in my position if he earned his job, or would you assume he deserved it? The audience reacted with a mixture of oohs and applause. Jimmy seemed to realize he'd crossed a line. That's not what I meant, he began. Isn't it? Karoline asked, allowing a hint of her frustration to show. Because questioning whether women have earned their positions based on merit is a pretty familiar pattern. More applause from the audience, louder this time. I simply meant that your appointment was unexpected given traditional career paths, Jimmy attempted to clarify. The traditional path has traditionally excluded people like me, Karoline replied. Part of what this administration stands for is breaking down those barriers. My presence in this role isn't just about me. It's about showing young women, everywhere that those traditional limitations don't have to define their possibilities. The audience burst into genuine applause. Even people who had seemed hostile to her earlier appeared moved by her response. Jimmy recognized that the moment had slipped away from him. "Well said," he conceded. "And on that note, we'll wrap up. Karoline Leavitt, thank you for being here tonight." "Thank you for having me," she replied professionally, but did not smile as broadly as before. As the band played them out and the cameras began to pull back, Jimmy leaned over during the applause. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "you handled that last question better than I expected. No hard feelings?" Karoline stood up, straightening her jacket. "It's not about feelings, Jimmy. It's about respect. Something to consider for your next political guest." Without waiting for his response, she unpinned her microphone, handed it to a nearby technician, and walked off the stage with her head held high. The audience's applause followed her, noticeably warmer than when she had first appeared. Backstage, she finally allowed herself a moment to process what had just happened. The interview had been every bit the ambush her team had warned about, but somehow, she felt she had emerged stronger for it. In the dimly lit backstage area, a production assistant approached Karoline with wide eyes. "Ms. Leavitt, your car is ready whenever you're set to leave." Karoline nodded, still processing the intensity of what had just happened. "Thank you. I just need a minute." As the assistant walked away, Karoline felt her phone vibrating nonstop. In her pocket, she pulled it out to find dozens of notifications flooding her screen. Text messages from her team, news alerts, social media mentions, all exploding in real time. Lisa had sent a simple message. "Call me ASAP." Karoline stepped into an empty dressing room and closed the door before dialing. "You're trending everywhere," Lisa said immediately when she picked up. "That final exchange about women in leadership, it's gone viral already." "Good viral or bad?" "Viral?" Karoline asked, sinking into a chair. "Good. Very good. Even outlets that usually criticize us are calling it a powerful moment." "Hang on. The president is trying to reach you." Karoline's heart jumped. "I'll call him right away." "Before you do," Lisa said quickly, "you should know that Kimmel's team is already putting out feelers about having you back on the show." Karoline laughed in disbelief. "You're kidding. Apparently your appearance just gave them their highest ratings in months. The producer called our office literally 2 minutes after you walked off stage." "Tell them I'll think about it," Karoline replied, though she had no intention of returning anytime soon. "I need to call the president now." After hanging up, she took a deep breath and dialed the direct number she rarely used. The president answered on the second ring. "Karoline." His familiar voice came through clearly. "I watched the whole thing. You didn't just hold your ground, you gained ground." "Thank you, sir," she replied, relief washing over her. "It got pretty intense at points." "That's exactly why it worked," he said. "The American people saw a real person defending real policies, not a talking point machine. When he tried that cheap shot about your qualifications, your response was perfect, authentic and powerful." "I spoke from experience," Karoline admitted, "maybe more directly than I should have." "No," the president said firmly. "That's exactly why I appointed you. We need voices that can cut through the noise with truth. The days of robotic press secretaries are over." After finishing the call with renewed confidence, Karoline checked her social media briefly. Clips from the interview were already spreading like wildfire, especially the final exchange about her qualifications. Comments ranged from supportive to critical, but the sheer volume indicated that her appearance had struck a nerve. A soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. "Ms. Leavitt, there's someone here who'd like to speak with you." Karoline opened the door to find a young woman, probably in her early 20s, standing nervously in the hallway. She wore a production assistant badge. "Hi," the young woman said, fidgeting slightly. "I'm Tess. I work on the show. I just wanted to say..." She hesitated, then continued in a rush. "What you said about breaking down barriers for women meant a lot to me. I'm studying political communication, and seeing you hold your own tonight was really inspiring." Karoline was touched by the unexpected moment. Thank you, Tess. That means more than you know. Most of the guests who get grilled like that either blow up or fold completely, Tess continued. You did neither. Would it be weird if I asked for a picture? Not at all, Karoline smiled, genuinely this time. After taking the photo with Tess, Karoline decided it was time to leave. The studio hallway seemed different now. Crew members nodded respectfully or offered small smiles as she passed. Whatever they had expected from her appearance, she had clearly surprised them. Outside, her government SUV waited at the curb. The driver opened the door for her and Karoline slid into the back seat with relief, finally alone with her thoughts. As they pulled away from the studio, she gazed out at the Los Angeles night. Her phone buzzed again, a text from her father. Watched with Mom, so proud of you, kiddo. You showed them what you're made of. A lump formed in her throat. Her parents had watched her handle one of the most challenging moments of her career. Their approval meant more than any viral clip or trending hashtag. The next morning came early. Karoline woke in her hotel room to the sound of her phone ringing. It was 5:30 a.m. in Los Angeles, which meant the East Coast was already in full swing. Karoline, Lisa's voice was urgent. Have you seen the morning shows? They're all talking about the interview. I just woke up, Karoline mumbled, sitting up in bed. How bad is it? That's just it. It's not bad at all. Turn on your TV. Karoline grabbed the remote and switched on the hotel television. A morning news program was showing a clip from her interview, the moment when she had turned the tables on Jimmy about the fake breaking news. The hosts were actually praising her. What we saw last night was a masterclass in handling gotcha journalism, one commentator was saying. Regardless of your politics, you have to admit, she showed remarkable poise under pressure. Another clip played, her response about women's qualifications being questioned. Social media metrics displayed on screen showed hundreds of thousands of shares. Even the networks that don't like us are giving you credit, Lisa continued. The White House switchboard has been flooded with messages, mostly positive. And get this, women's leadership organizations from across the political spectrum are sharing your clips. Karoline was stunned. She had expected to wake up to damage. Control, not praise. What about Kimmel? Is he saying anything? His Twitter post from last night just says, "Thank you to Karoline Leavitt for a memorable interview. Sometimes the best conversations aren't the most comfortable ones. No snark, no jokes, almost respectful." Over the next few hours, as Karoline prepared to fly back to Washington, the story continued to evolve. Political analysts were dissecting every moment of the interview. Some criticized Kimmel's tactics as overly aggressive. Others praised him for asking tough questions. What surprised Karoline most was that figures from both sides of the political divide were acknowledging her performance as impressive. At the airport, she noticed people looking at her, some openly staring. A woman approached as Karoline waited to board her flight. I don't agree with your politics, the woman said frankly, but I respected how you handled yourself last night. It's nice to see someone who can disagree without being disagreeable. Thank you, Karoline replied, genuinely touched. That means a lot. On the flight home, Karoline had time to reflect on what had happened. What had started as a potentially career-damaging appearance had somehow transformed into a defining moment, not because she had won against Jimmy Kimmel, but because she had remained authentic in a media landscape that rarely rewarded authenticity. When her plane landed in D.C., the impact of the interview had only grown. Her phone showed missed calls from major publications requesting interviews about her experience on the show. Several talk shows wanted her as a guest. Even more surprising were the messages from political figures on both sides of the aisle. Some offering congratulations, others expressing newfound respect. As her car approached the White House, Karoline felt a mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. She had faced one of the most challenging interviews of her career and emerged stronger for it. Walking into the West Wing, she was greeted by spontaneous applause from staffers lining the hallway. The president's chief of staff approached with a rare smile. The boss wants to see you, he said, gesturing toward the Oval Office. Inside, the president was waiting, watching a news segment about the interview on a muted television. He turned it off when she entered. "You know what impressed me most," he said without preamble. "Not that you handled the tough questions. I knew you could do that. It was that you turned it into a teachable moment about respect and truth in media. That's exactly what this administration stands for." "Thank you, sir," Karoline replied. "I just tried to be honest." "Well, your honesty struck a chord. My phone's been ringing all morning with people who normally wouldn't give us the time of day, saying they were impressed by your performance. You've created an opening for dialogue we didn't have before." As Karoline left the Oval Office, her deputy handed her a printed schedule for the day. At the top was a note: "Press briefing attendance expected to be double normal size." "Everyone wants to see the woman who stood up to Jimmy Kimmel," he explained with a grin. Later that afternoon, as Karoline stood at the podium facing a packed briefing room, she felt a new sense of purpose. The questions were still tough, the political divisions still deep, but something had shifted. Reporters who had previously been dismissive now listened more carefully to her responses. Those who had been openly hostile seemed more measured in their approach. One veteran reporter raised his hand. "Ms. Leavitt, many of us watched your interview last night. Has the experience changed how you view the relationship between the administration and the media?" Karoline considered the question carefully. "What happened last night wasn't just about me or this administration," she replied. "It was about whether we can still have difficult conversations in public without destroying each other. In the process, I believe we can. It requires respect on both sides, a commitment to facts over gotcha moments, and the courage to engage authentically, even when it's uncomfortable. Last night wasn't perfect, but it showed that even in our divided times, genuine dialogue is still possible. That's a lesson worth remembering for all of us." As she concluded the briefing and walked back to her office, Karoline knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new controversies, new battles to fight. The brief moment of goodwill might not last. Politics rarely allowed for extended periods of civility. But something important had happened. For one night she had broken through the noise and reminded people that behind the talking points and political positions were real human beings trying to serve their country as best they could. In today's climate, that counted as a significant victory, not just for her, but for the possibility of a healthier public discourse. And that, Karoline thought as she closed her office door, was worth all the discomfort of that fiery confrontation. On Jimmy Kimmel's stage. "Retry Claude can make mistakes. Please double-check responses."